everybody. This is Craig from the Pacific War Channel. This is Echoes of War. Joined here by my co-host, Gaurav. How are you?
Hey, Craig, great to be back here and really looking forward to diving into the heart of the action of our 7 Years War series.
The meat of it all in Europe, that is. For, everyone who's probably already looked at the title of this, we're now jumping into the European theater of the 7 Years War. And we're joined here by our guest, Simon. How are you?
Hello, thank you for inviting me. And let's get some real chunks out of the history.
Yes, because you're representing the European theater, and Gaurav's representing India, and I'm representing North America when we do these episodes. It's actually kind of funny how this all works out.
I'm just going to raise my hand right now. I'm not studied as much of the Indian theater of this war as much as I've done for the European theater. I got to really prepare for the episode in 2-3 weeks from now.
Yeah. And before we jump into it again, I just want to say, if you haven't joined us on YouTube, please consider doing so. Honestly, by the time this airs, we might be on the Kings and Generals YouTube podcast channel because, at the very least, the longer format episodes are going to go over there. Maybe the entire podcast will be moved over there. I'm not so sure where I'm working with things right now. If not, we'll be found at the Pacific War channel. But we're going to have a lot of maps, a lot of portraits up here. It's more of a visual experience. I really implore people to try and check us out there. And of course, if you'd like to further support the channel, consider checking out the YouTube membership or the Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War Channel. By joining either of these, you get access to my exclusive podcast series, which I'm working on episode 33 as we speak. The polls are up, but I'm pretty confident it's going to be the Battle of the Coral Sea. We'll see. And you get early access to all the content I make and voting rights to the subjects I will tackle next. That's my shameless plug. We can jump right into it. I guess, Gaurav, you want to start?
I'm just bringing up a map, and please excuse me that I have way too many tabs than I'd like.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, luckily this one was pretty early to find. Just let me know if the screen's up. Yep. So, all right, folks, this is the map in Europe where we are looking at the belligerents for the 7 Years War. As we mentioned last time, Frederick the Second of Prussia with his two Silesian wars, which were part of the broader war of Austrian succession, had pretty much pissed off a lot of monarchs in Europe, to say the least, with his opportunistic aggression. And in that war, he did take this area, which I'm just moving my cursor around, which is called Silesia, which was a really tax-rich haven, representing 25% of the Austrian monarch empire's revenue. So it's a pretty big loss. Russia has also emerged after its victory around 40 years earlier in the Great Northern War. France and Britain, anyways, they've been fighting for on and off for 600 years now, 700 years. So that rivalry is going to endure. In the build-up to the war, the biggest change is a series of diplomatic maneuvers. First, you have the Anglo-Prussian alliance, as Britain and Prussia sign an alliance so that Prussia will be able to support Hanover, which is a land owned by the King of England. It's their hereditary possession. The monarchs here were known as the Hanoverian kings of Britain. And currently it's King George II. And they also moved away because they felt like Austria was doing a pretty shit job because they were the previous allies of Britain on the continent. And it is British strategy to have one powerful ally on the continent while it will focus on economies and naval warfare in the colonies against France. France, on the other hand, was pretty annoyed for two reasons with Prussia. One, Prussia cozying up to Britain because historically Prussia was an ally of France. And second, Frederick's pretty rash diplomacy really triggered France's animosity. And at the same time, Russia also cozied up to Austria because they were unhappy with Prussia's growing influence. Because keep in mind, up till the Silesian Wars, Prussia was an insignificant state and now had announced itself as a European power. The main reason is Russia wants to keep Poland, Lithuania as a buffer zone to Western Europe. And they fear that if Prussia becomes too powerful, they are going to interfere. So that was the diplomatic revolution that took place in the build up to the war. But perhaps before we get into the details of how the opening maneuver started between Britain, France, Prussia, Austria, everything, we should take a moment to understand the shift in warfare. We did allude a little bit to it in the previous episode, but maybe spend a little bit more time talking about how it changed, etc. So just give me a second. I need to bring up a different image. So warfare that we knew from the 16th, 15th to 17th centuries saw the early advances of the muskets and arquebusiers into the military, but it was still, you had some amount of typical ranged units like your bow and arrows. You still had heavily armed infantry armed with pikes, swords, and you still had the cavalry, which were like a mix of light cavalry for recon scouting and the heavily armored knights. So, one of the common formations, as we can see here, this is an example of the Spanish tercios, were one of the key big formations of muskets and pikes. This was the core unit of an army that went through this time. And I don't actually do that, but yeah, this was the core unit of movement. And the Turkish that the Spanish and late by default the imperial armies used had a 80 to 20 ratio in terms of the pikes to muskets. So it was still predominantly a melee unit, you could say, and it was quite densely packed. And one moment. This is an example of how the unit would be positioned during battle. Now, what also changed is warfare until the 30 years war predominantly utilized insane amount of mercenary soldiers as well. The great thing about mercenary soldiers, you don't have to conscript your own population. And on the bad side, well, if you bring about a lot of mercs, you got to pay them. Otherwise, it could lead to pretty atrocious sacks, as we saw during the 30 Years' War, where cities across Protestant and Catholic Germany were utterly sacked, brutalized by these mercs who were let loose. It began to change with the Swedish intervention, where you had Gustavus Adolphus come with a larger conscript army, and he moved to more firepower. So the ratio of muskets to the pikes started to almost equalize in his units. Another key advancement was actually the use of the flintlock muskets. This was you could call it like the next advancement of technology, which later would be surpassed with the use of the breech loading rifles, like around 100 years or now from the 7 Years' War. But the main advancement is the powder is more potent, the shots can go longer. So it does make the musket a much more effective weapon. And conversely, it also meant that plate armor and armor in general is just out of fashion now. Even at 100 yards, someone can be killed by a firearms bullet. And the amount of armor that you would actually need to protect yourself has now become pretty prohibitive, since it would have to be like very thick for anyone to wear and unwieldy. So I think only the heavy cuirassiers would be the guys that would be even wearing just a breastplate. Otherwise, units across the battlefields, as we will discuss, they're going to be unarmored. They're going to be killed exactly the same by cannonballs or musket shots or the bayonets. And the last major change was, instead of living off the land and taking supplies, since the armies of citizen soldiers grew exponentially, there were pre-prepared depots and war treasuries scattered across all the nations. And this is from where, through slow-moving supply columns, would the various armies be supplied with food, munitions, uniforms, boots, etc. With that, Craig, maybe you'd like to talk about the different units types.
Yeah, sure. I'm just
You want me
gonna
to pick up that
share.
image?
Yeah, sure. Let's start with that image, and you can just like go through the different nations' military forces. Just wait. Okay, it's up. So yeah, when we come up to the 7 Years' War, it's, as you explained, it's now characterized more so by like professional standing forces. It's supplemented still by mercenaries, but the more regular armed forces, conscripts, are now making kind of like more of the bulk of the military forces. Most nations are maintaining regiments at the core organizational unit level. Typically, this is like 500 to 1,000 men. They're divided into companies, about 50 to 100 soldiers, and the infantry is going to form, of course, the backbone, with line infantry regiments making up the bulk, supported by units like elite grenadier companies. So these are the taller and stronger guys who are reserved for assaults. I guess you could see them as like the precursor to storm units. Cavalry is, of course, always going to be
I'm pretty
popular.
sure the Soldier King was pretty happy to hear that.
Cavalry is, as always, very important still. You're going to have heavy cavalry for charges. You're going to have medium dragoons for mounted infantry roles, more mobility, light hussars for scouting and harassment and such. And artillery is getting much better at this stage. There's going to be artillery batteries with field guns, howitzers, providing range support. And, very important for sieges and such. Weapons are standardized. So you mentioned the flintlock muskets are coming in. The British are going to have their brown besses, which is, the most famous weapon for a long time for redcoats. The French, we're going to have the Charleville. This is effective to about 100 yards for volley fire. Soldiers are also carrying bayonets instead of those melee weapons. So it's turning muskets basically into spears. It's a very dramatic change for warfare. But officers are still going to brandish swords and pistols. Cavalry is going to be using sabers, sometimes lances, and carbines if they're specialists. Very difficult to shoot.
As I was just going to say, as Jack Churchill always said, an officer cannot go to battle without his sword.
I have to make an episode to him at some point. Definitely. What a character. Artillery employed cast iron cannons, firing solid shot, grape shot, or canister. Training is much better now. It's really, a lot of people are drawing influence from the Prussian model, which of course is going to come under Frederick the Great. He's going to really wield that with an iron fist. It's going to be more discipline in drills. Recruits are going to undergo rigorous marching and close order formations. They're going to be practicing linear tactics at firing range. Volley fire is going to be involving the front rank shooting. So I guess at this point, I just want to put up some models of what the volleys look like. So I'm going to put up the French, Dutch, and English first. There we go. Just to give an idea visually what these formations might look like. You also mentioned the change in logistics. So obviously, they're not, quote unquote, living off the land fully. Logistics are still rudimentary. So supply trains are hauling food, powder, and shot, but it's pretty limited, at this point. At a tactical level for the 7 Years' War, it's revolving very much so around linear warfare. In Europe, in North America, it's completely the opposite, actually. But here in Europe, it's definitely linear, where the infantry form long lines to maximize their firepower. My audience is like 80% American, so you've probably seen Mel Gibson's The Patriot movie. Just basically, it looks like that. That's if you want to visualize it. So men are, forming up these lines, and there are varying tactics of how they're going to do this. There's a famous battle in the 7 Years' War at Rossbach, which showcased volley fire, for example, with ranks alternating shooting and then reloading, followed by bayonet charges to break the enemy lines. Cavalry would be used
I'm just
to
going to say
flank
that's
or
one
pursue.
battle. Just going to say that's a battle we're going to discuss today, and it's one of the best victories of Frederick the Great.
Of course. Don't want to get into it, though. I want to tease it. For the cavalry, of course, it's same as ancient warfare. They're there to like flank the enemy, pursue when the enemy is routed, where the majority of casualties are going to be inflicted. They often help up. The cavalry can also rally up after a bombardment by artillery, for example. That can also be a thing now. Formations are very rigid. Columns are moving all as one, with lines for combat to maintain cohesion. There's also differences when it comes to these formations. So I'll put up Frederick the Great's oblique order, which definitely was interesting for this time. Strategically, these battles and the war overall, it's a war of maneuver and attrition. Commanders like Frederick the Great would use, interior lines for rapid concentration, outmaneuvering larger forces through forced marches and surprise attacks. Sieges are still kind of, dominating, with fortified towns like Quebec in North America that was besieged for 3 months before they had a real battle, or Schwinditz, hope I pronounced that right, was besieged using trenches.
I'm just going to add that for the European theater, sieges were not as prominent, given the, as you mentioned, the drastic improvement of field guns.
Yeah, of course.
That it's now become this warfare is more open battles and skirmishes rather than sieges, which was the dominating
of the previous few years
of the 30 Years' War.
And
Simon, you mentioned something?
I think it's also important to point out that the numbers of soldiers has improved so much that it's far easier to split off a small force of your troops to still besiege a town and just move past it, which happened regularly in the 7 Years' War, where they just ignored cities, sent like a few hundred or a thousand men there to keep it on watch, to starve it out while the main army moved forward.
That's true. It's actually
there's an example of that we will be talking about in one of these battles. I'm not going to get into which one yet, but it does allude to your point, Simon.
You're definitely right. For the European theater, sieges are kind of falling apart. In North America, it actually is the dominant thing, because basically the North American campaigns are riverine and lake battles, and they're all held by significant forts. And almost every significant battle in North America is just some fort being attacked. So almost all the battles are sieges, or they're forced engagements where they just force the enemy force to come out and face them on the field. But again, they're so different. The French-Indian War versus the European theater, it's like it's linear versus abstract. Yeah. But
I was just going to say, the reason why people might think that it looks kind of dumb that where you have the line units moving forward, but I actually did think that when I was a kid. First time I saw Patriot. It looks counterintuitive, but there was a big sign, since movies do kind of embellish the accuracy of the guns.
Yeah, of course.
It really was not that great. And it still isn't. You still maybe suffer battlefield casualty even to this day for a few hundred bullets fired in combat zones. It was, I think, 4,000, 5,000 for World War II.
Definitely. But could you, by any chance, just toss up the picture of the units again?
Yeah, just one moment. The reason they move in such close order formations is just to keep cohesion and encourage each other, because smaller groups are much easier to scatter. Larger groups, you kind of feel a bit more emboldened. You're willing to just risk it because you have your comrades with you, and it's a great protection against cavalry.
Absolutely. When it comes to the different nations and their units, like more or less at this point, most nations have basically the same standardized, units that we have already mentioned. But I guess in general, the Prussians would be rocking more like elite fusilier regiments. So, I think the grenadiers would be more specialized and a bit more impressive. Britain, of course, would have they'd have more towards their amphibious operations. So they're developing something that's kind of akin to a Marine, I guess you could say in some ways. And they would be pioneering light infantry tactics. In North America, they'd have something like Rogers Rangers, for example, which they were trying to adapt to guerrilla warfare, especially in the dense forests. So that's again something that's not relevant to the European theater, but they were developing specialized units. France was, I don't want to say stagnant, but France was boasting what they've always traditionally been boasting. But they did also dabble in, some marine infantry development to try and contest with the British, of course. I guess of all the players in this, the Austrians would be kind of the most interesting since they're such a cosmopolitan group of different peoples. They would have a lot of different fighting styles.
The differences between getting, like, say, some of the Germanic speakers versus the Austrian versus the Hungarian units within the empire.
The Croatians, everybody. You have a lot of different units there. And of course, if you're looking at the Russians, we got the Cossack cavalry, of course, the traditional ones we're always thinking of. So there is some variation amongst the different nations and how they do things, but more or less, it's pretty standardized in Europe, I'd say, at this point.
You could just say there's the line infantry, there's the grenadiers, who would be your biggest punch, and then you have skirmishers and light infantry, who are going to fight in a more loose individual basis. You have your dragoons, you have your hussars, and you have your cuirassiers, with dragoons being kind of like a mix of a hybrid of range and gunpowder cavalry, whereas your hussars are just your standard melee cavalry, and the cuirassiers are your heavy melee cavalry. These are probably the last set of units in Europe at this moment that would probably be even wearing some amount of plate armor. I think that's what you could pretty much just broadly summarize all the unit types.
And anybody who plays like an RTS can basically figure out the units.
That's a bit simplistic if you see it in Age of Empires, but yeah. All right, so I think we are now ready to get into the war a little bit. So let's start about what kicked off the war in Europe. So we're not going to be talking about the British islands of the attack on Minorca, or the fact Britain and France have technically been fighting for a little over a year now in Ohio.
Yeah, it's the crossover of what we over here call the French and Indian War with the 7 Years' War. There's a few years kind of molded in there.
Yeah, essentially the opinion of time was more or less like, those are the colonies, so what do we care about if they're fighting? They're fighting constantly anyways.
Exactly.
Yeah, let's maybe just start with how Frederick attacked Austria again, and what were the reactions of everyone, and we get into probably the first major battle of the war. So, as we mentioned, the alliances have changed across Europe. You've had the Great Diplomatic Revolution. Spoiler alert, it would completely dissolve after the war for both teams. And Frederick began to get intel that the Europeans other monarchs were still pretty pissed off with his brazen diplomacy, and were openly plotting to kind of take back Silesia, make pledges and such, right, between the Russians, French, Austrians, and Swedes. He tries a bit of diplomacy to go to the courts to try to say, okay, I'm willing to talk it out. And they are so fed up with Frederick at this point, they don't even hide the fact that, we just want to take back what's ours, and war is the only answer. Now, Frederick then decides, okay, I tried diplomacy. Now I need to use my special diplomacy weapon, which is called invade. And he launches an invasion of Saxony. One of the key advantages Prussia has is, thanks to the drilling and system of administration, they are able to mobilize significantly faster than any other state in Europe at this time. And he overruns Saxony pretty quickly, at least through their borders. And his invasion is so brazen. No one, people were not even expecting it. It was said Maria Theresa was not even in Vienna at this time. She was in her country retreat having a holiday and immediately just rushes back to Vienna to start coordinating with the French. And this is where the Treaty of Versailles, not the famous one that France forced Germany to sign in 1918, 1919, but one of the many treaties here was signed, which was a pact of mutual support between France and Austria against Prussia.
And
And
another thing
yeah,
with this invasion of with why he invaded Saxony was that he thought that the Saxons would attack him, or that they were part of this alliance, which for a fact that they were not. This is one of the
yeah, that
greatest
actually is
blunders he made in his entire life, that he thought Saxony was going to fight him, which they had really no idea of. They had nothing in the works. This was just his imagination. But
and
it
that
would turn
actually-
out that it would give him a tactical advantage in the future.
Yeah, it does. It's a mixed blessing since it does ensure that the imperial diet, that is the rest of Germany, kind of declares war on Frederick, because he did invade a state without a declaration of war and for no real good reason. But
Yeah,
Saxony
and-
was a pretty developed state, and it would finance him pretty well. About a third of all his expenses that he's going to incur in the war, the entire 7 Years' War, is going to be financed by Saxony. So it was a good state, and the intention was he wants to take this so that he can prevent it being a springboard for the Austrians and French armies to link up and invade him. Because he was aware Russia might want to go after East Prussia here, and Sweden might want to, and Sweden was promised Pomerania by the Austrians. So he does invade Saxony, and the same old thing happens. When you are fighting for your home, you fight harder. Frederick's plan was pretty ambitious. The man wanted to overrun Saxony in a few weeks at most, occupy Dresden, their capital, take over the treasury, take over their army, and then invade and then winter in Bohemia, so that he's creating a big buffer zone for against the Austrians, who he expected would be the first enemy that he would face. However, the Saxons they played a delaying game, and it was not until 9th of September 1756 that Dresden even fell. And to his surprise, though, the Austrians did mobilize pretty quickly as well. And you have the army of Austria that quickly goes to the Saxon border. It's not a particularly large army. It is about 34,000 men, and it is commanded by Field Marshal Brown. His full name being Maximilian Ulysses Brown. He is the first commander, and it is a big surprise for Frederick to see that an Austrian army of significant strength has mobilized in front of him and ready to fight. And by this time, the Saxon king, the Prince Elect of Saxony, who's also the king of Poland, Lithuania, he has also abandoned with quite a few of soldiers who go to Poland and are going to be linking up with the Russians later. So it's a bit of a double whammy. And the imperial diet has now declared war on Frederick. And since France and Austria have also declared war, it is now, you could say, without territory violations, the French armies are now able to cross over Germany to attack Prussia.
The interesting thing about this imperial diet is a lot of people rightfully think of the Holy Roman Empire at that time to be just completely incompetent. It barely exists. But at this point, I always like to call it that the Holy Roman Empire follows the rule of fuck around and find out. If you can do a lot of things, but the second you overstep the line, all hell will break loose. If you fight all of Germany, most likely you will lose. That is a disaster for you. But you can do a lot of shit and still get through with it. At least if it's fighting internally.
You mean like during the 30 Years' War and having, 500, 600 political entities with their own commands in the Holy Roman Empire?
Yeah. But the infighting is not gone, as we will see very soon. It's still there,
True.
but the HRE is not weak. It's disorganized.
Controlled anarchy. I like that. So we have the first battle, which is called the Battle of Lobositz, which is the first engagement between Frederick and the Austrians under Field Marshal Braun. At the start of this battle, the Austrians have already set up, as we could see on this map. They are based behind the small stream here. Behind the main force is behind Sulowitz, and Lobositz is also another stronghold. And they have a small force of about 2,000 men at the village of Velhota. But key positions that they have in Lobositz and Sulowitz are hidden trenches for the infantry and hidden artillery emplacements. One of the biggest upgrades Austria did have in the 10 years between the War of Austrian Succession and the 7 Years' War, they really upgraded their artillery. Pretty well, though. So the Austrian artillery is not going to be incompetent. It's mostly the commanders that generally tend to be incompetent. Not all of them. I think, Simon, you might agree with that.
Yeah, there were a few competent ones. Braun, for example, he is competent. Yeah, he's a really good general.
Competent. I wouldn't rate Braun that well. I do rate Field Marshal Daun much higher.
Well, Braun was not one of the true greats, but he was competent, at the least.
Okay, all right. I'll give you that. Better than Charles of Lorraine.
That's not a challenge.
But yes, so the Austrians are already in a defensive position, as we can see with their blue lines here. But keep in mind, bulk of their forces are behind this river. There is actually like a bridge here, which is supposed to be used for crossing. Frederick is marching down to the Elbe Valley, and what he currently believes right now is this is just an Austrian rearguard. He's not facing the main Austrian army. What he does is he starts to deploy at the mouth of this valley and does tactically very astute deploy his forces on the Homolkbach hill here, where he's going to drag a lot of artillery guns. Now, the first engagement does start when the Austrian contingent under General Laun over here, which is about 2,000 strong, it's not a really big component, decide that he's going to outflank Frederick, because the greatest tactic of set-piece battles is only outflanking your enemy. And he does manage to, without being detected, get onto the Lobositz hill to try to fall onto the Prussian left flank. Frederick, on the other hand, wanted to take this height anyways, and had already deployed his his left flank to move up. And it actually became like a slugfest without much order, since the terrain was pretty uneven. You're fighting through like a wooded hill. So you're not going to have your typical line formation battle. You're just going to have your, just like every man for himself. And those 2,000 Austrians would actually suck up way more soldiers than, way more than 2,000 soldiers. It was a slugging match. And right now the Austrians have deployed a total of about 34,000 men. And Frederick has about 28,000, out of which only 18,000 are infantry, 10,000 are cavalry, and he has 97 guns, whereas the Austrians have a clear advantage of almost 26,000 infantry alone. They don't have that much cavalry. Now, Frederick is still at this point convinced that this is the Austrian rearguard. It's not a significant force. There's still a bit of a haze and a fog, and he sends a cuirassier group to kind of like go on a reconnaissance in force. And moment they entered the main plain of the Elbe, the Austrian cannons decided to welcome them with a destructive barrage. As these guys, move forward to kind of reconnoiter the area between these two villages, Lobositz and Lobositz, the Austrian cavalry engaged them. Initially, they do a successful feigned retreat after the first battle. So the Prussian cuirassiers are like, yeah, we're beating them. And keep in mind, the Prussian cavalry is not as good as the Austrian cavalry. It's the weaker, you could call it the weakest of the three battle arms of the Prussian army. I'm not sure if Simon would agree with that. I think it is.
Yeah.
Prussian
at least
cavalry was pretty. You mean unless there was a commanded by General Zeton?
Yeah.
But yes, they have a successful feigned retreat. And it was also at this moment Frederick realized, oh shit, we are actually facing a pretty sizable force. And when the Prussian cuirassiers actually kind of pursued them, that's when all these hidden units from the villages, the infantry in the trench, some trenches, and the hidden guns, they opened point blank on the Prussian cuirassiers. They are devastated. And it leads, then the Austrians also countercharge and they fully withdraw after taking heavy losses. And they kind of regroup with the main infantry here. So actually, between the two infantry lines, you would actually have like all the Prussian cavalry gathering up. So all 10,000 of those guys. And the Austrian guns are really loving the Prussian cavalry so much this battle, they're only targeting them. Now, while Frederick is assessing the situation, the all Prussian cavalry are getting mauled. And they decide that they had enough. And without orders, they charge. Not really good for discipline, but then again, it's the Prussian cavalry, so. And the cavalry, they do damage the Austrians, they do push them back. But the further they went, they are now exposed on their flanks since they're not supported by the infantry. And Field Marshal Brown does send in a few regiments or battalions of soldiers across. And they repel the Prussian cavalry, and those guys have taken pretty heavy losses by now. Now, concurrently, as Field Marshal Brown was actually deploying his infantry to go across the bridge to Salowitz to mass up for an attack, the Prussian artillery that had gone up to the Homolkpa hill, now with the added advantage of the height, they are now pouring in a thunderous barrage. So the Austrians know they cannot use Solowitz as a mobilization point as intended. And in the meanwhile, the Prussian left flank has completely defeated the Austrian contingent here and are moving back. But concurrently, since he saw the Prussian cavalry retreat in disorder, and this is like the full strength of all his horsemen, Frederick does a Mollwitz. He hands over command to Field Marshal Keith and withdraws from the field of battle, giving orders to the Field Marshal that he can withdraw. So that at least Frederick will say, I did not withdraw, my Field Marshal withdrew. But guess who saves the day?
Hey guys, this is Craig from the Pacific War Channel. Please don't forget to check out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account over at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where you can join the ranks and gain access to a hell of a lot of goodies. At the base minimum, you get access to the exclusive monthly podcast, early access to all of my content, voting rights for what subjects I will tackle next, and At higher tiers, I have much more goodies to come, so please click that link and check it out.
The Prussian infantry. So what happens is this force is in panic retreat, and they kind of go down to Lobositz, pursued by the Prussian left flank, and Field Marshal Keith decides to advance with the left half of the Prussian infantry center, and they storm through Lobositz. There is some pretty fierce fighting. It goes door to door, and this is when Field Marshal Brown, realizing it's gonna take too much time for him to deploy his army now across the longer redeployment route, just decides to call it a day. He withdraws his forces, with his forces here that were behind the stream providing covering fire as his forces evacuate Lobositz. And the Prussians kind of camp on the field of battle, which is the traditional sign of anyone saying that, yes, I won the battle. You can't call it a great victory for Prussia in this battle.
Yeah, I would say that it was most likely something like a draw for the most part, because while he was able to push them back, he got slaughtered in the woods. We have several accounts of people just being appalled by the whole forest being littered with corpses, and the damage to his cavalry was massive as well. So his losses were massive. This could have been a way greater disaster, but it certainly was not a victory.
Thanks to the Prussian infantry to save the cavalry's ass once again. Like Molwitz again. But yes, the main outcome was Frederick could claim that he won the battle, but it was a draw. Of his 28,000 men that engaged in this battle, he lost about 3,300 to 3,400 soldiers. Keep in mind, he had a smaller army. The Austrian losses were actually 3,200 or so, slightly lesser, but they had 6,000 more men. So, in terms of percentage, definitely the casualties favor the Austrians. But the biggest outcome of this battle, I would say, is it delayed Prussia's advance into Bohemia. That was Frederick's key goal. He has to winter in Saxony. And he also badly underestimated how fast everyone else would also react. Because towards the end of winter 1756, at the Saxon-Austrian border, the Austrians have about 140,000 troops already now deployed in 4 armies. Field Marshal Brown commanding a center near the city of Prague, and you have 3 screening armies around each flank, with the leftmost force actually being closer to the imperial cities of the imperial diet. The intention being that since France has now committed 130,000 soldiers to taking back all of Silesia from Frederick, they are going to be the Austrian contingent that's going to link up with this army. Now, later what we'll have is in the summer, we are going to have the Battle of Prague, as it's called. Simon, would you like to take us through the Battle of Prague if you are ready for it? Since this is where all the enemies reunite.
That's true. So essentially, now we are moving the armies to Prague. The winter has passed. The Prussians are essentially split into 2 forces for the march. You have one that entered from Silesia, which are commanded by Jurin. They previously had won a small battle, the Battle of Reichenberg, where they sort of gained entrance into Bohemia and secured essentially Silesia for the time. And Frederick now moved in after his winter quarters in Saxony, and they both unite.
I would also just add one of the biggest outcomes of that battle of sorry, forgot the name. I know, remembered with R.
Reichenberg? You mean that?
Reichenberg is when the Schwerin's army did reach into Bohemia, they actually got enough supplies to last themselves for a month or so. And Schwerin had an army of around 30,000 men. Keep in mind, Frederick has deployed a grand total, including his largest contingent, around 120,000 men. So it's a pretty significant chunk of the remaining troops, since I think he kept about 40 to 50,000 with him. Field Marshal Keith was another person who was covering, you could say, Frederick's right flank, which is the closest to the imperial cities and the imperial diet. But yes, Schwerin and Frederick would reunite around Possek. And I'll also just say the Austrians also have a change of command. Prince Charles of Lorraine takes over from Field Marshal Brown at Prague, and he's determined to fight. But he does a pretty good job of getting in supplies to Prague. I gotta give him that.
And he actually manages to pull his forces together, because the forces that were at the time waiting for the French army have now decided to also join them. And he essentially focused all his, or as much as he can get, his strength into his army to essentially prevent a further entrance of Frederick into Bohemia.
When Prince Charles gets the news that the village of Possek has fallen, what he does is he deploys his army outside of Prague to the east of it, as we can see on this map. Ultimately, it is you can call it like a L shape at the most. He has about 63,000 men, some say 66,000 soldiers. It's about 47,000 infantry and 70,000 cavalry with 200 guns. The northern line, as you can see in the map, are north of the Tarborg Hills, and they are facing the town of the Prussia, which was where the Prussians are reported. And Field Marshal Brown is commanding the other half or wing of the army, which is bent southwards on the right. So you could just think of it that they have formed loosely an L shape of battle. And right now we have Field Marshal Schwerin, who is just in command. And this is when Frederick links up with him. Frederick has also a similar sized army, though he has slightly more cavalry and 200 guns. And depending on the source, some say he had 190, some said he had 210, but probably around the same figure of 200 as the Austrians. So it's a battle of equals. And keep in mind, Charles actually does have the ability to summon immediate more reinforcements, as he has about 13 to 15,000 garrison troops still in Prague itself. They are not involved in this fighting. The Prussians decide that instead of attacking the main northern fortifications and defenses of the Austrians, they are going to outflank and move to the far right. That is, they will be taking out Field Marshal Brown's forces. And they began this really long deployment. But Field Marshal Prince Charles did notice this. And what he does is from his center force here around these hills, he redeploys about 40 companies of grenadiers to Field Marshal Brown and about 15 squadrons of cavalry led by General Hajic to plug the gap here. And his movements were just in time because the advanced Prussian guard of cavalry, which was at this time under General Skoniak, had arrived, and they would just be engaged in a melee at this south of this village of Stehenboli. And this is going to be a slog for the entire battle. Right? Neither side are going to be gaining an advantage at this moment. And while the Prussians are conducting this march, as you can see, from Prosek all the way down here, and they need to cross over this small water body and stream to form up. The Austrian guns are pummeling them, and the Prussian guns cannot move quickly. There is only a single road actually that moves between all these villages on the intended route of march. Otherwise, it's a quagmire swamp, and you had a traffic jam that just formed with the slow moving supply and artillery wagons that a good chunk of the infantry of General Schwerin and General Winterfeld, who would be commanding the infantry columns here, these guys had to go through a marsh. They had to walk through that quagmire. So by the time they just come here, they've been mauled by artillery and are bloody exhausted, to say the least. Now, after we have that deployment, Field Marshal Brown is attacking, and Frederick has again not given the order as he waits for the infantry to form up. But what we have is the forces of Winterfeld here, which will be where my cursor is pointing around the village Hotzawitz. He attacks right away without orders because he recognizes that the more he's delaying, the Austrians are going to reinforce their defenses and they're going to be sitting ducks. Frederick was pretty annoyed again that the commander attacked without orders, but this is where Field Marshal Schwerin just supposedly said to the king, Frische Eier, guten Eier. Something like, the early bird is supposed to gain the best or something. Simon, maybe you could just tell me what
he said, as you said, he said, Frische Eier, gute Eier, which literally translated means something on the lines of fresh eggs are good eggs. So essentially, yeah, as you said, encouraging him to get into the fight and better to attack early than wait around and lose the opportunity. And Frederick also really respected Schwerin. And when I'm
Even
talking English, I cannot say his name. Schwerin.
But he did kind of omit his results at Mollwitz.
Yeah.
But yeah, he did obviously respect him. Otherwise, if he did not, the guy's not going to be commanding an entire army of the Prussians. But the reality is, as you can see, right, by this map, it is that the Austrians are deployed on an elevation, and this is like around 300 to 400 feet if we go by this, this legend. And the Austrian cannons from the Hornberg Hill, which is where Brown's forces are deployed, they are absolutely shredding the Prussians as they advance. And the Prussians have been ordered by the generals not to engage until they get into close quarters. That's where the Prussian bulwark, as their infantry can be known, is going to absolutely shred any Austrian. It is at this moment catastrophe does strike for the Prussians. We have a situation where General Winterfeld is hit pretty badly. He's shot through the neck. He's not mortally wounded, but he is pretty seriously wounded. And General Schwerin decides to go and link up and protect, like help so that his body is his injured form is removed from the battlefield. And shortly after that, General Schwerin is hit by a canister shot and mostly had his head blown off. He dies at the spot. And this is when he was trying to lead the infantry forward. So the hero of Mollwitz, one of Frederick's best generals, has met his fate here. And now the Austrians, thinking that they have victory, Field Marshal Brown now makes the decision that he can charge. Right, the Prussians have already suffered. They are going to be, they're going to be, they are just ripe for the picking, and he makes a charge. And this actually was the biggest mistake of the battle. This is where the battle turned completely against the Austrians. As he moved down, the gap between the Austrian lines at the north and Brown's forces on the right, or the east, you could call it, they open up, especially around this village of Kige. And the Prussians were not idiots. Frederick, because he has established the officer training school, at least the lower ranking officers are competent. And Field Marshal Bebern, who is commanding the forces here, he and his regimental officers decide, well, thank you for the opportunity, and just rush across this river and start attacking the flanks of both the northern and eastern fronts, you could call it, of the Austrian line of battle. And to make matters worse, Field Marshal Brown at this moment is also, around this time, is hit by a cannonball while leading his troops forward, shatters his legs, and he's gonna die a slow, painful death like my favorite French Marshal Jean Lannes. And coincidentally, General Zeton has now arrived with his hussars and reinforces the cavalry battle that has been going on at the extreme south of the battle zone, you could say.
And I just want to say, keep that name in mind. Zeton will play a really big role in the future, and for all the shit we give the Prussian cavalry, Zeton is definitely
He's the
not the
exception.
issue. He is a real respectable cavalryman.
If we all talk about if people don't say Mura is the greatest cavalry general of the Napoleonic Wars, I'd go as far as saying Zeton is his equivalent of the 7 Years' War.
Like, the amount of battle this guy will fight in is enormous, and the impact he has is always great.
But yeah, I think we'll get into his escapades in some of the upcoming battles. But the Austrian cavalry are, they're being pushed off, and this is where Brown's infantry who are now in close quarters, so they are now getting beaten back by the Prussian infantry. And then they realize that Zeton is about to launch a pincer. They all retreat. And it is said at this time Prince Charles of Lorraine suffers a stroke and is incapacitated from command. But other Austrian generals do, around the Tabor Hill over here, do form an impromptu line. Now, what happens is the other half of the Prussian army is still here, and they're getting pissed off that they are not getting into the action. So, what do? General von Manstein, probably a relative of my favorite general, since Prussian aristocracy, and Prince Henry, a younger brother of Frederick the Great, they quickly cross the river and just smash into the Austrian forces at the north. That's it. The battle is over, you could say. The defensive line here it's now no longer needed. 40,000 troops quickly retreat to Prague. About 12,000 retreats southwards away from the battle zone. And what happens is, Frederick does claim the victory, but it's a pretty costly victory to say the least. He had about 14,300 casualties. The Austrians had a slightly less, but you could almost call it equal number of casualties. 40,300 to 13,500. It's not really much of a difference. But yes, he does take the field of battle.
The thing is also why he had many casualties is just that while the infantry was marching, you have to imagine they are constantly shot at by artillery. And it's a real miracle and a testament to their discipline that they actually managed to reach the enemy. A lot of different armies would have probably broken at that point.
Yeah, I think I did mention it, but it was when they were making their march from the north to the eastern flank. It is around here where I did mention they have only one usable road, which became a traffic jam. But and otherwise, you have to go through pretty marshy land. And this is where Frederick now begins his siege of Prague, which is one of the first major sieges of this battle, this war. And he does think he can take the city since Prince Charles and over 40,000 Austrian soldiers have now, joined the mouths to feed in the garrison. But there was one little problem. Prince Charles did a pretty commendable job, to say the least, in stocking up the city. And Frederick gets news that Field Marshal Daun is moving to reinforce this army and relieve the siege. Now, initially, he does think that it's a small army, 15, 20,000. But to his utter shock, if we include the 12,000 or so survivors from who retreated south from the Battle of Prague, Daun is now marching with 54,000 pretty experienced soldiers to relieve the city. And Frederick now has a decision to make. As you mentioned, Simon, he does have about 50,000-ish soldiers here. And he has to now split his army into two. But 20,000 is still enough to maintain the siege of Prague, which is holding around 56,000 garrison troops right now. And Frederick does set out to meet Field Marshal Daun in combat and is in for a pretty nasty surprise. Simon, would you like to talk us through this upcoming battle, which pretty much shattered Frederick's confidence?
Yeah. This will
Do
be...
you want me to bring up a map?
Yeah, that would be great.
Just give me a second.
This will be, essentially, just to say the least, one of the... He would have the worst luck he could possibly have, and everything that could go wrong will go wrong. So let's get over it. So, as you already mentioned, he doesn't really have much intel on this army that Brown has, and he doesn't exactly know where they are. So he is moving from the west side and moving to the east. And that's when he essentially starts to spot the army. So he starts to deploy the armies, while still keep moving forward to the east.
I'll just add a little bit of context just before this. We talk about this disposition. Is Field Marshal Brown had reached the field first and deployed his army, as we could see, across some hills and villages. Initially, Frederick was to a village it's not shown on this particular map, but it was to the southwest of this position. And Dawn had actually gotten some faulty intelligence that Frederick was about to get 60,000 more reinforcements. Completely fictitious, but that actually caused him to enlarge his line. And Frederick, anyways, having seen Dawn has taken the good position, but doesn't know to how far the line extends, had redeployed his army over a 2-day forced march to kind of try to come in from the north, as we could see, and then turn the Austrians on the flank towards the river. That was pretty much his strategy, and that's where you could see that he is moving down this road.
Yeah, and as you say, he doesn't really know where he is. He expects him to be on the two central hills and have his army be there. So he thinks that he can sort of shorten the march by going through a forest in what is essentially the center of the Austrian lines, which he doesn't know.
It's kind of like around this area called Kreskor. That was the shortcut.
Yeah. So he sends his soldiers there in order to fight them, to fight the Austrians. But of course, he meets the line of the Austrians, and they get absolutely shot to pieces because they do not expect anyone to be there.
And it is around this time also, Field Marshal Anhalt Dessau, his two divisions here had deployed and were getting mauled because Dawn, by virtue of taking to the field first and not moving, he's already entrenched his infantry and guns. They are opening fire. Zeton is fighting Nadesti already. The cavalry are engaging on the flank. And you can also say right now, Field Marshal Bevin deploys his units to actually take this village of Brezan as sharpshooters are causing some havoc to the Prussian columns.
Yeah.
And
during all that
just
time,
one more thing.
They are still deploying.
I just wanted to say, yeah, just one more thing is the size of the armies. Dawn, as I mentioned, is coming to this battlefield with over, 54,000 soldiers. And Frederick is coming with about 34,000 troops. He is also outgunned. Dawn has entrenched 154 guns. Frederick has 90 guns only. So he is fighting an uphill battle because he can't afford to be sandwiched at Prague by two similar sized armies. It's kind of like what Caesar wanted to try to avoid at Alesia, but the only thing is Caesar had Romans who knew how to make pretty big forts and they did not have to deal with cannons. But so later you could say pretty much every unit of Frederick's army, infantry, cavalry, are all committed to fighting on the entire length of the front, and his forces are going to be stretched pretty thinly.
Yeah, and Frederick is hoping the entire time that he will once again break through, like have the miracle, despite being constantly shot at by the artillery, harassed on every side, like in the previous two battles. His discipline still winning the battle and being able to push the Austrians back. But unfortunately,
it started. Yeah, I'll just continue. I think I'm just getting to the same point.
Yeah. But unfortunately, this time, it will not be enough. It's just the casualties are mounting and they are getting ripped apart.
And it's not like the Prussians are not making inroads. They are making inroads. The problem is the Austrians outnumber them almost 2-1. Every gap on the Austrian lines on these hills, their defenses, every time an Austrian battalion is destroyed, a fresh one has already arrived to replace it. The cavalry reserves are now moving in, and the defeat starts when one of the Prussian cavalry brigades loses its commander and its nerve, and they retreat. The Prussian right flank cavalry here, they've also taken a battered and withdraw first. Only Zeton's cavalry tends to be the ones that can actually continue fighting amongst cavalry units. And by then, Anhalt Dessau's and Bevern, Field Marshal Bevern's, their divisions have been taking heavy losses. And it is at that point, Frederick just gave up because I think he finally realizes that he's beaten. And this battle is an absolute disaster for Frederick.
Yeah,
the losses. Yeah.
There are essentially two aspects of this. One is the losses, as you just tried to say, which are absolutely massive. I don't have exact numbers. Maybe you have them.
Yeah. So of the 54,000 Austrians that were engaged, the Austrian casualties are estimated around 8,000 to 8,100. Around 15% of the force. So you still got to give it to the Prussians. Despite being in a terrible position, they did inflict some sort of a bloody nose onto the Austrians. But of the 34,000 Prussians that engaged in this battle, the Prussian losses were about 14,000 to 16,000. Almost 50% of his army were casualties. 50%. Let the numbers sink in. It's a complete disaster, and Frederick gets pretty suicidal and depressed after this.
Yeah, that's a big part. He actually sends a letter to his sister, and essentially is trying to convince her to form a suicide pact between the two of them. Because they are really close, because they suffered through the abuse of their father together. And they sort of think of themselves as being the only two they can really understand each other. But
I'll get to that letter writing in a bit when we get to another battle. But yeah, it was a disaster. And it's actually a big what if for this battle. Did you know that? If Frederick won here, he could have actually won the entire war right here. It would have been over. If he won at the Battle of Kolin, as this was known, France would not have crossed the Rhine to send its armies to aid the Austrian and Imperial faction. Sweden definitely would not have come into the war, and Russia would have probably withdrawn from the war quickly, which would have meant Austria needed to make a peace. And Frederick would be the one dictating terms. Instead, emboldened by their big victory, the wolves gather around to take the war to Prussia. And from here, you could say that the 7 Years' War in Europe now kind of changes from like a decisive warfare engagement to attritional battles that are going to be taking place across the theaters.
Another thing that Frederick essentially loses in this battle is his myth. Before that, he essentially has won every battle. The people thought of him as sort of unbeatable, but this proved that the other's armies had a chance against him. And just a massive morale boost for the coalition against him. And he, as mentioned, he himself and actually his troops not as much. The troops still had hopes and thought that they could win this, but he himself was very distraught.
And things are about to get a lot more worse. Okay, Simon, I think we should cover the arrival of a new faction into the war, the Russians. Battle of Gross-Jägersdorf. I'll just bring up the map. So as in one of the various the maps that we showed of the factions, East Prussia is separated by Poland. And Frederick did leave a army there, but not a big army. It's about 25,000 men that were there in East Prussia to just guard against the Russian invasion. Russia was not really known for its supplies, though I think, Craig, you and I can agree that they don't seem to have learned that lesson even in World War One.
Not until Stalin's purges.
Yeah. So we have this Battle of Gross-Jägersdorf, where a pretty large Russian army under the Russian general Stefan Arpuskin does invade, and he is facing the Prussian force of about 25,000 men of General von Lewald. And they had just captured the siege of Melmet, which is a port in East Prussia. So it kind of does open the supply lines for the Russians to kind of keep supplying their forces. And that's where this large army, including the unruly Cossacks, begins its advance. So Simon, would you like to continue about this battle?
So the Cossacks do what the Cossacks do, and they raid the place. They pillage, they burn, they raid everything they can get their hands on. And they terrorizing the land. They are moving through East Prussia. And at the same time, the Prussians are moving in from the west. But the Russians they have spotted the army. They know that an army is on the way, but they do not know where it is. And they also do not know how big it is. They completely actually fail before this battle to deploy sentries. They do not know that a battle is about to happen. So this is essentially turning into an ambush. So the Prussians deploy and start moving, essentially forming up the battle lines while the Russians are still in camp. And the first engagement that really is happening is, I think this is the engagement that is happening to the north. And this is when the Russians first spot the army.
It's like the cavalry engagement, which you could see at this northern part here and southern part. That were the first opening moves of General Lewald's forces.
Yeah, and the Russians, it's at the beginning utter mayhem. They do not know what's happening. Parts of them are fleeing, other parts are trying to form their units and try to push them back. This is actually going so well that the Prussians are now moving their main forces through the forest. And while they're doing this, the Russians had enough time, well, the main Russians army, which was camping to the northeast.
Around here.
Yeah.
Near this forested area, right?
Yeah, essentially a bit to the northeast there. Started to form up and also move into the forest. And this is also turning into a slog. These two armies are now fighting.
I just say, sorry. I was just going to say the biggest reason is you had General Peter Rumainetsev, who would become the best Russian commander. He managed to rally the troops. So that slowed down the momentum of the Prussians.
Yeah. And essentially, now they are fighting essentially through the entire line. Just a diagonal across essentially this map. And the Prussians are at the beginning doing really well, pushing back the Russians. But they are heavily outnumbered.
Yeah. And the Cossacks, being Cossacks, do a proper feint retreat and kind of like destroy the Prussian cavalry on their front. And that kind of caused pretty much General Lewald to cut his losses and disengage. Yeah. But by then it was a pretty heavy defeat. The Russians suffered about 5,400 casualties which is about 10% of their force. The Prussians, on the other hand, they lost about 4,600 men, but they had half the army from the get-go. And this opened up East Prussia completely to the Russians, who did not know what the hell they should do because they had not planned for the supplies.
But this battle actually is one of the reasons why Frederick manages to fight on and get out of his dread and suicidalness and decides, okay, because the Russians retreat after this battles, as you said, they have no plans on what to do further.
And they don't have supplies also, that's the more important.
Yeah, and the supplies. And this essentially convinces Frederick that maybe there is a chance I can win this. And he decides that if he cannot win against the Austrians, then he will search a different army to fight.
That's all you need, right? A new army to fight. Similar to Napoleon. And I'm just going to talk a quick thing about what was also happening in the war at this time. Was the French have already begun their attacks, but they have not attacked Prussia. 1 second, let me just bring up the map. the French have actually attacked Hanover, which is the British possession of King George, and it was actually defended by the Duke of Cumberland, a son of the king, and all he did was kind of just screw up pretty much. And a French army led by Prince, the Duke Louis de Letellier, engages him at the Battle of Hastenbeck, and the Duke of Cumberland is pretty badly beaten with his 35,000 against 60,000, and he surrenders. Right, it's not a major battle in terms of like fancy maneuvering or whatever. It is just a case of both commanders believing that, oh, I think I'm losing, and making some errors. It was just a case that the Duke of Cumberland's errors was pretty uh much more significant, and it also destroyed his reputation because after that battle, we have the Convention of Clausewitz, which meant that Hanover as a force is completely withdrawn from the war. It does not mean England is out of the war. It just means Hanover is withdrawn from the war, and they can only have about a garrison of 4,000 men. And Frederick was pretty unhappy because this now means the and north is completely open, because he was kind of relying on the British to send him supplies via Hanover and money, and also kind of guard that flank. King George is pretty pissed off with his son, that George II has said to us, said, "Here is my son who has ruined me and disgraced himself." Yep, that's your father's approval, man. But through this difficult time, one of the greatest battles of Frederick's career is about to take place. So, as we mentioned, after the Battle of Kolin, Frederick is pretty depressed, to say the least. He, he's taken up big losses. His victories have also not been very spectacular. They've been pretty bloody victories. The Russians have now invaded, and he knows that Hanover is out of the war. And Britain doesn't seem too keen, which, as we alluded to, Britain is kind of on, like, Europe is not our priority. We are focusing on the colonies. And
from
the
an
French,
outside perspective, it really looks like Prussia has no chance of coming back from this. Just saying.
Oh yeah, and at the same time, I'm not kidding. The Swedes have finally joined the war and have occupied Swedish Pomerania over here. So you could just imagine, right? It's like the wolves are closing in.
Psychologically,
right?
It looks like you've got 4 points, like all converging upon you. Yeah, it looks bad.
And Frederick is like pretty upset, and as he said, Simon mentioned, he does he proposes a mutual suicide pact to his sister because he does not want to live under the enemy's rule. And he also suffered a further ignominious incident where an Austrian cavalry force did occupy Berlin for a few days and ransomed off the city. So it looks pretty bad. And this is when he's also lost. There was another battle, like another engagement called the Battle of Moise on the border with Bohemia, where General Winterfeld was also defeated. Now, the greatest thing about Frederick, and this is, I think, one of his greatest moments to me, is this, except for the excessive amount of letters sent to his sister, the soldiers and generals all thought this guy is still conducting himself with the same vigor, same energy, enthusiasm. They did not know that this guy is like borderline suicidal at this point. But for them, that's amazing. And as Simon alluded to a few minutes ago, he needs to find a new army to kind of restore morale, because the Saxon soldiers have now started to desert en masse, which, in Frederick's words, is not a really bad thing because they are of inferior quality. And he begins to decide, he decides that the Imperial army, which is gathering on the western fringes here near Saxony, the Imperial Austrian army, they are going to be his target. And this is where I think one of his early statements about the HRE comes into play. Officially, you have two commanders who take the who have, like, overall command. They are field marshals. Just one moment. I'm just also bringing up a map of the battle. I really need to find a better way to put all these maps. I have. Just one sec. But yeah, so as we just get into the battle, you have the Prince de Soubise and Prince Joseph of the Imperial Army. They are the nominal commanders, but with so many, what do you call, political entities all fighting and everything, it's kind of like a clusterfuck of who's supposed to be in command. The commanders do not have much authority. And as we can see here, so what happens previous to the battle, it's not kind of visible on this map, because keep in mind the terrain of these maps is over a larger area, and there's several other villages where the initial movements were. Frederick decides to approach and take on this Austrian army. And it's a pretty sizable force that he's going up against, because he has only 22,000 soldiers and 79 guns, whereas the Austrian French are almost 42,000 men, and they have 110 guns. And both initially miscalculate where everyone is, and the all French and Austrians are kind of camped somewhere around here, and Frederick only knows about their presence because of, like, the trumpeters. And it is also at this point where the Prince de Soubise, the French commander, keep in mind about 2/3 of this army is French. He kind of says caution, and the Austrian commander is like, "Nope, we are going in all guns blazing." And so Frederick, on the Janusberg Hill here, which is the central feature, was deploying his forces at that point, thinking that's where the battle is. Initially, the French and Austrians moved down from their camp, and he thinks that, oh, these guys are retreating. Great, I won the day. And then when he starts seeing the cavalry start to then turn towards the east, he's like, oh god, they are not retreating, and he needs to think fast. And this is where you could give, like, the credit and quality of the Prussian army is its due regards. He immediately redeploys his army en masse. He has Prince Henry move most of the artillery onto the top of this Johannesburg hill. It'll take some time, but that's what they're doing. General Zeton is moving quickly and is coming to this villages to the south here to kind of engage the Austrian and French cavalry, which are their vanguard on this point, while the rest of the Prussian infantry are moving also to form their positions on this particular village. Right? This was the on the village of Seidlitz. Sorry, I mispronounced that name. And during the engagement, the General Zeton and his cavalry charge with their counterparts. And he is very strategic about the way he uses his reserves. So even though he's outnumbered, he is taking a bigger toll on the enemy. And by the time the Prussian infantry start forming up around Seidlitz, they kind of, it's not clear here, but they kind of form a kind of acute trap, or kind of this kind of formation just into the mouth of the Austrian and French columns that are about to advance. Concurrently, the artillery under Prince Henry, which had been dragged to the Janusberg Hill, they now start opening a deafening bombardment on the French and Austrians, which are just kind of caught in a kill zone. By this time, General Zeton has completely, he's chasing off the French and Austrian cavalry completely off the field. And as the Austrian and French infantry columns come to the forefront, they are in column, so very few, only the forward few ranks can fire, whereas the Prussian vanguard has already deployed into line and in acute firing position, and the trap is sprung and the carnage truly begins. And the biggest coup de grace is as the Prussian infantry start bulldozing their way through the Austrian infantry. General Zeton, after he chases the enemy cavalry away for a while, he halts his units, does not pursue the chase, and actually falls on the Austrian infantry here. So they are getting bombarded by artillery, Prussian infantry from the front, and now they're being outflanked by the cavalry. It's an utter disaster for the Austrian forces. And the casualties Frederick suffered in this battle was minimal. If you are talking about a ratio, nothing beats this. He suffered about 550 casualties or so. That's it. No senior officers also lost this time. The French and Austrians suffered about 10 to 11,000 casualties. But the biggest victory you could say for this battle is it convinced the British to continue backing Frederick, and King George did repel the Treaty of Clausewitz, and Hanover now re-enters the war, so his flank is safe. But Simon, I think you would agree, Rossbach pales in comparison to the next battle that we're going to discuss.
Yeah, that next battle is really interesting and considered one of his greatest, if not the greatest, battles of his life. And I also want to just add one more thing to the Hanover situation. As you said, it now re-enters the war. And essentially the British asked Frederick to put somebody in charge that can defend this. We will finance the army there that will defend it, but you have to put someone in charge. So he chooses his brother-in-law, which is kind of funny because he absolutely hates his wife. But he is such good friends with his brother-in-law.
Bros before hoes, I guess.
You could say that.
I mean, I can't think of any other statement. But it's definitely like we do have to also, probably not today, but we need to spend some time definitely talk about the various major commanders. But perhaps we should now get into the Battle of Leuthen.
Yeah.
It's like I'm trying to just get up an image. Actually, I do have like multiple images of this, so maybe you could just set the context, Simone.
Yeah. So essentially, this is right after the battle with the French. So they are now retreating. His western flank is secure for a moment, so he once again can focus on the Austrians. The Austrians at the time have now moved into Silesia, have taken parts of it, especially taking back the regions of Bohemia they had lost previously. And the commanders that were sent there, as you already mentioned previously, were defeated. So, yeah, this entire region is now under the control of the Austrians. So Frederick now moves there to essentially retake it, to gain back his foothold and secure his territory so they cannot move further into his territory.
And there was this one big advantage for Frederick and his men. They did their war games in this region of Silesia that they were about to fight. And it was also at this time Frederick was the closest to his army. It is said because this battle of Leuthen does take place pretty late into the year. It's literally 5th of December, and you normally don't have such battles, but both armies moved on a convergence to each other. But during the days in camp, Frederick would actually be going around his camp, sitting on the campfires with his soldiers, talking to them as if they were, his equals. He's not showing that haughtiness that nobility and rulers will show. He sits, warms the seat for the next person, talks about, encourages them. And with the recent victory at Rossbach, morale is also now restored in his army.
Yeah, the thing is, he also would later, in his philosophical works after the war, famously put out a statement that the king is the first citizen. So he essentially followed that logic and talking to the soldiers.
I just really like the fact that he would be sitting with them at the campfires more than anything, rather than having them come to, like, say, his royal tent or whatever. So you got to give it to that. And now I'm going to be bringing up a series of maps which explain the maneuvers of this upcoming battle, because he is still going to be pretty outnumbered. At this battle, Frederick has about 36,000 men, and the Austrians under Prince Charles of Lorraine have around 65,000. Right. Of the 35,000 Prussians, it was 23,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry and 160 guns. Austria had 43,000 infantry and 22,000 cavalry and 210 guns. Though the Austrians did have some slightly higher caliber, so bigger guns. Just one moment, bringing up the first battle map, because Battle of Leuthen is a great example of using maneuver battle.
Yeah, Napoleon later would even say that this was one of the battle he admired Frederick the Great for. That this was one of the best instances of warfare through movement.
So yeah, if we just look at this, so when Frederick deploys his army, he does see that he takes the nearby Born Hill from this village of Hayday, and what he sees is from the village of Leuthen, and around it is the Austrians have centered in two great lines around 8 kilometers long, and they are already prepared because they had detected the Prussian movement. So what he does is around that village of Bonn, where he is, like Borna here, what Frederick does, which is this force here, is just a single infantry battalion and a cavalry set of squadrons. This is to kind of just lull Charles into saying that, okay, my attack is going to be here. And Charles does believe that, because while it's not shown on this particular map, there is a kind of wooded forest here, which he thinks is going to be why Frederick is going to attack here. What he instead is doing is the rest of the army, artillery, everything are literally moving back, and there is some hills here that completely mask their movements. And time is actually against Frederick in this battle. He starts his day at the advance by 10 a.m. but it's only like 12:30 in the afternoon where the infantry and cavalry start coming in, with General Zeton coming to the far flank here. It's kind of not clearly visible on this flank, but it's closer towards the river, and the the Prussian infantry also start to arrive, and this is the Soppenberg Mountains were his biggest ally, you could say, since it masked his movements. And Frederick's intention was to attack this particular flank, the southern flank, which crucially was not manned by Austrians. It was manned by Saxons and Germans, which were of relatively inferior quality, you could say. And as we can see here, Charles now decides once he sees this move, while Frederick's forces have already formed up, he starts to redeploy his second line to reinforce this, but he does genuinely believe this is just a diversionary force. And knowing that they are going to be out of sunlight pretty soon, General Zeton does engage the Austrian cavalry, pretty convincingly beating them off. The artillery of the Prussians have come up to Ragsdorf, Lobositz, and another hill here. I can't recall that name at this moment. I had made in my notes. I'm so sorry, folks. But on this elevation, the Prussian artillery now starts to open fire, and the Prussians advance in an oblique order, with the right flank leading. And the Austrians are completely shell shocked, and they are already like in the midst of redeploying their forces to the north and then redeploying to the south. So you can imagine the confusion and mayhem in set piece battles that this the confusion has brought forward.
And also the exhaustion from just moving back and forth.
Yeah, it's at least a 1.5 hour march one way. And this ensured, as the Prussians began their advance, one moment. I was about to open the wrong particular tab. So, like, both forces now start to converge on the Battle of Leuthen, because once the southern half of his line had disintegrated, Charles had to pivot his army from, facing west to now face south. Because initially he did not want to redeploy his forces here because he believed that is where the main Prussian attack is going to come. And General Zeton by now has driven off the Austrian left flank cavalry, and General Neiper here, which is this unit in particular, they are the Austrian left flank cavalry, and they charge but are checked by Frederick's dragoons, which had been kept in reserve, and the radix of artillery guns also blast the Austrian horsemen to bits. And Frederick is now, the Prussian infantry gained the village of Leuthen through pretty vicious street to street fighting. And ultimately, they are able to force the Austrians completely out of the field and take a pretty impressive victory. Of the forces that engaged in this battle, Frederick suffered about 6,300 casualties, and the Austrians took 22,000 casualties. So it did completely restore Prussian morale. No doubt would have damaged the Austrian morale, to say the least. And this is also the last battle of Prince Charles of Lorraine, because I think the Imperial Court at Vienna decided to say that, okay, boss, enough is enough. You're not really good at your job here, so let's just move on. But I did realize that we have gone past quite a limit, so I think we should end today's episode here after the Battle of Leuthen and continue with the European theater in the second and third parts, as the Russians and French armies are now going to come in force.
All right. Well, certainly it's an extravagant victory for him, and it really is clutch since he suffered such massive defeats to pretty intelligent ambushes from before. But yeah, they're still in the war, and the war is, of course, going to be escalating in other parts of the globe as well, and we'll get to that. But before I let the audience go, obviously, if you've been listening to this as an audio listener, I would be very confused. we do reference points on maps that you can't see. So again, if you want to join us on YouTube, please do. If you don't want to, that's no problem. I'll try in the next episode to rein in a bit more audio friendly ways of interpreting these battles, because I imagine it's kind of jarring. And again, if you'd like to further support us, please consider checking out the YouTube membership or the Patreon account at www.patreon.com/the Pacific War Channel. Every month I upload an exclusive podcast. I think this month it's going to be the Battle of Coral Sea, though I did look at the polls during the podcast, and it seems the other choice of how the alliance system led to World War I might win out. I'm kind of surprised, but it's about a 50-50 chance it's either or. You also get early access to all the content I make, and I'm going to be uploading some stuff actually later this week. And of course, you get to participate in the ongoing polls I have. And I don't only put up Pacific War stuff. I try to hit any historical era I can and put up, even fantasy stuff now and then, and maybe sci-fi in the future. We'll see. It depends on the audience.
Let's go for Grand Admiral Thrawn, guys. Please suggest that to Craig.
Thrawn trilogy, abridged.
Hell yeah.
Well, actually, I'll tell
I'm down.
I'll actually give a sneak peek to something it's only going to be months from now. But on Wizards and Warriors, the fantasy channel for K&G, I've been tasked with reading a Russian sequel, I guess you could call it, to Lord of the Rings. And I'm going to be doing an entire series on The Last Ring Bearer. And it is absolutely batshit crazy. Aragorn is a evil tyrant. Gandalf is basically Hitler in it. And yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun. The Mordor final solution is a real thing in this book. It is very entertaining, but it'll be in the future.
Simon, I think Conrad Kurz would really and Angron would really love this place.
Yeah.
Oh, I can't even get. We'll do podcasts about it. It is the most fascinating book I've ever read from this Russian author. Completely unofficial.
Like that.
Yeah, would be sued to hell if he actually published it officially. We'll call it, although a lot of people have read it in the East. But yeah, that's to come soon over there. But stating all that, again, a big thanks to our guest Simon for trying to get through it. It's a very complicated World War Z situation. It is all over the place. Thank you for being here. And until next time.